connecting to video, so we'll kind of keep things. Hold on, I can close this. See people better. I hope everybody is doing great, has had a good holiday. It's good to see everybody's faces once again.
This new year.
Bill, the beard just keeps getting longer and longer. Gary, we've been drinking some good wine. That was so sweet of you.
Yeah, he kept it all, Gary.
I did not. Hi, Elizabeth. Jason, I haven't seen you in a while, man. Good to see you. DC's there, but all I see is the chair. It's just an empty chair.
You guys, we're set.
All right, sweet. Rick's there. Cool. Lots of friendly faces. So the way that we tend to run this thing, we can't have 50 people all talking at the same time. So we have our core crew with their audio on, respectfully talking over one another. And if somebody needs to get unmuted, we can always jump in and unmute someone. We're going to talk about long exposure today. I'm going to go through, talk about some images, talk about kind of a mindset for thinking about both using long exposure to get better quality landscape or still life images, as well as using it creatively to just blur motion and take a whole bunch of questions. There have been so many great questions just on long exposure submitted. I know a lot of you submitted sort of specialized equipment questions. And I've been chugging on a project trying to get it kind of done, but I'm going to jump in via email and answer some of those specific gear questions, whether it's fluid heads or some of the camera questions. I'll just email you about those. Woody, do you have anything you want to put out quick, just kind of rules of the road here for people that might not have been in one of these before?
Right. So we ask that people pre-register at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. You can submit a question or not. You don't have to register ever. But if you do have a photography question, it goes to our spreadsheet. We cull it, sort it, and answer as many as possible each time we do this. We try to do this every couple of weeks through the pandemic times and beyond, hopefully. But we really enjoy doing it and seeing everyone. Like Hudson said, you're muted for the most part. If you need to ask a question, you can ping one of us to unmute you or just ask it in the chat and we can try and get to it. We do have an announcement. So along with today's office hours, we're announcing that we're going to open a project for long exposure. So project, if you haven't heard before, project is a online e-course where Hudson, Rick teach and you learn about a single topic. And so this one's going to start in February 4th. So we'll have about a month to register people, and pre-registration's open now, and I'll let Hudson talk a little bit more about the formatting and the topics and how everything fits together. But I encourage you to take a look at hudsonhenry.com/projects and get on that list. And then we'll send out an announcement email probably at the end of the week to the people that are pre-registered to get first dibs on spots. There's going to be 20 spots available.
So, and Rick and I, we can go back and forth on this a little bit. Some of the faces here were in our panoramic project towards the end of last year, which was a really fun experience. It's kind of an intensive group project where we're all working on, expanding our skills in a certain realm of photography. We're going to be doing long exposure, hence doing the long exposure office hour today. I've been kind of just all long exposure lately. And we learned a couple things running the panorama project via Zoom meeting. The idea being there are 20 spots, but it's two different groups. So you wind up in a meeting with just 10 people. Everybody can be talking and asking questions. Nobody's muted. And we decided to stretch it. We did it all in a week last time with kind of one exercise that everyone was working on. And we thought this time start on a Thursday night, February 4th, and kind of introduce everyone to each other, talk about the project, and then over that weekend do a quick exercise where everybody gets on the same page and we kind of get everybody tuned for doing long exposures. We have a lot of meeting time, and then over the course of that next week, everybody has some individualized time. There's a group chat everyone's on to be communicating with each other. but then a kind of a final project that's due at the end of the next weekend. So everyone has some time to work on it on their own. And we thought that might work a little better than the way that we ran the Pano project. It just seemed like everyone was crunched for time to be working in their daily life and doing it all at the same time. So this one's going to be a 10-day project. Rick, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you got it.
I'm doing a short video course on long exposures that I'll sell on my website, but people in the project will get that when they sign up. And it really kind of takes this course on crafting long exposure images and puts it into practical use in a group of people learning it together. So that's kind of the ultimate goal for the thing. So anything else, Rick?
Nope. I think you encapsulated it perfectly.
Sweet. Okay, so let's just jump in. I want to share my screen and talk a little bit about, Woody's got to give me the host powers back to do this. I'm going to talk a little bit about long exposure, and I'll go through sort of, my original.
Hey, Hudson?
Yeah.
We're getting some people, and I can hear it too, that says you feel a bit hot on your mic.
Oh, I'm a little hot on the mic?
Yeah,
right.
You might want to bring it down a bit.
All right, hang on. That's funny. It's supposed to be automated. Hang on. I should be able to turn that down a bit. Oh, wait. Oh, I have to disable that. How's that sounding? Is that better?
That sounds a little better to me. I guess we'll just sort of see. People are saying it sounds fine. So,
all right. Well, maybe I'll just.
It definitely doesn't. It doesn't sound as hot as it did before. So,
okay, I can tweak with it. If people are complaining, let me know. All right. I am kind of testing out a new system, so that's probably got something to do with it.
Oh, right, there we go. Guinea pigs.
I know. Sorry, guys. All right. So is everybody looking at my Lightroom here, seeing this bunch of images? I'm going to jump in, and I'm going to just run through. I'm going to talk about some of my early images that got me thinking about doing long exposures. I don't want to go full screen though. I want you to be able to see the settings. So I'm just gonna go into the loop view here. And I don't have exposure times for this. This is way back in like 2006. And as I started doing more digital and I was shooting medium format film, I was out just shooting kind of blue hour cityscapes, and just kind of by happenstance, started turning and watching cars come through the scene. And this is a medium format shot that's scanned into the early version of Photoshop and color corrected. But, I started playing around with things like 10-second shutter speeds. And, then on my travels, this is back in 2005, you see clouds moving fast through the city. And I thought, I wonder if I set up and capture for 13 seconds, how that's going to look. You get that kind of surreal look where the building's sharp and the clouds are flowing through. Or I remember one night camped in Death Valley, there was this Joshua tree and the moon was setting and there was a little glow on the horizon. And before I went to bed in the tent, I just set my medium format camera up with some Provia film in it and set it to go for 3 hours until, pre-sunrise. And when I got home and exposed the film, I'm like, wow, it was kind of inspired by Art Wolf's Star Swirls back in the early days. Vegas, just waiting for a car to come through and trip in the shutter for about 4 seconds and just capture those taillights moving through the scene. Coming into 2007, I started kind of experimenting with long exposures on the coast of Kauai and just blurring the wave action coming through these rocks at KA Beach. And I sort of started to find that with water and waves and waterfalls, I tended to like about a half a second exposure. I like to see the shape of what's happening. You feel the motion, but still see that shape. And, this scene kind of drew me into the fact that there's this still pool that's not being disturbed by the wave action. So you get that reflecting still water juxtaposed against the motion of the water along the coast. Setting up and blurring motion of people. I wanted to do a really long exposure here, but the security, the police, the transit police jumped up and said, no tripods. So I literally braced on a handrail with a wide angle lens and did a half second exposure here. When I'm talking about long exposures, there's sports and action stuff, wildlife stuff, where you might slow your shutter speed down. This is an 80th of a second. I'm hand holding and I'm tracking motion. and it's slower than you would normally shoot to get a sharp image. You're trying to blur the background to keep your subject sharp. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. That's a topic for another discussion with shooting action in sports and motion, just shooting motion. What we're talking about more is, here's another example where, it's a fifth of a second. I'm just holding braced really still. I wanted a little blur to the water, these waves exploding at the Queen's Bath in Kauai. I'm talking more about when you're set up to do a landscape and it starts to get lower and lower light, and you still want to keep a pretty low ISO and have a nice clean image and have a narrow aperture to have the foreground to background all nice and sharp and in focus. Locking down, having to use that long exposure where it's really critical that you're firing your camera in a way that doesn't induce any shake, that your camera's set up to capture as sharp an image as possible at a really long exposure. So there's sort of two things that you're going for with a really long exposure in my mind. And one is just crafting that perfectly sharp front to back landscape image at the lowest possible ISO and the highest possible enlargeability and quality. And the other one is, is doing more creative type captures. So, here's another example where this rock in the foreground is so close, that mountain in the background so distant, the light is so low. This is 1/1600th of a second.
It's just 3 seconds.
1600 ISO at 3 seconds. Yeah, I needed that tripod. I saw this scene and we were hurrying. My wife was just, early. Well, she was pretty pregnant. We were pregnant. We had planned this big trip to Patagonia and we thought we'd get pregnant afterwards. And instead we got pregnant about 6 months before. And so she was relatively pregnant. We were driving into Torres de Paine for the first night of camping. She was hungry. And I see this just beautiful scene just on this little lake as we're driving along. And I hopped out to capture it quick, and it was just, shooting it at 6400 ISO because of the given light. I'm like, wide open. I have to get the tripod out. Just hold on. And so I had to set up to do a long exposure to get something that's beautiful and enlargeable. And, made up for it by cooking a really good dinner when we did get to the campground. But, oops, I don't know why it keeps wanting to. There we go. Here's another, just beautiful scene from that campground. I will say I'm glad I did that because on that trip, this was the only still night in Torres de Paine where the wind wasn't whipping the lakes into a froth. And, there was the only reflection that was so perfect clear of those mountains that I was able to get. Normally it was more like this. These kind of blue hour low light scenes. This was on a workshop in the Palouse with Rick, setting up, 2 seconds is the only way to get this. The Eiffel Tower right before the fireworks on Bastille Day. And then there's the scenes where, it's an interesting landscape. It's not so spectacular. This is from our workshop in Patagonia, just a little over a year ago. And it seemed like we're down on this little island in Lago Pijo, and it seemed like it was just going to be a beautiful sunset. I was so excited about the color, and I set up to do a panorama. This is a pano. And then, the light sort of fizzled a little bit, and there's wind on the water, but you can see there's kind of a reflection line. There's less wind in the foreground. I thought, it's set up. Let's try a long exposure here. And it's just, there was a little color that came in the course of this 2-minute exposure. But to me, it's just way more interesting and surreal. You're smoothing that lightly rippled water to create the reflection of the mountains and just that kind of surreal cloudscape, sharp mountains, blurred sky.
Can you go back to that one?
Yeah.
So that one's not a pano, though.
No,
that would be you couldn't really get that as a pano at that time length.
Well, it would be hard because the lights are changing so fast. It's really, post sunset, afterglow.
Yeah.
2-minute exposure panos are tricky as the light's changing. I think that the wind was consistent enough that it would be okay from a foreground perspective with that long exposure, but it would be tough.
Yeah.
Here's one of a mosque on the Bosphorus River in Istanbul, where the river was really whipped up and wavelets were on it was kind of disrupting that reflection. And so by slapping a little neutral density on and dropping down to 30 seconds, all of a sudden, to me, I really like the way that the reflection is across the water. just more interesting to me. Both are nice. You know, anytime I see traffic moving through an early or late city scene, suddenly I think, what's a little longer exposure? Here's kind of an experiment with, what's 5 seconds look like? What's 13 seconds look like? The Bay Bridge from Treasure Island. Here's kind of a fun one. This is just testing out a new fisheye that I had, a 16 millimeter fisheye. And the focus of this is really, what does this look like down here inside the pier? This is in La Jolla at Scripps. And, setting up on kind of the edge of the waves and slowing it down to 20 seconds, all of a sudden you have this weird, misty, magical door, clouds blurred as they're moving by in the background. This fountain, this was with David on the last workshop that we did in Charleston, David's hometown, great town. And this is the spider fountain, right, David? Oh, David might be muted. So the spider fountain is this, cool fountain where all these arches of water come and hit the pedestal in the center. And this little boy was playing, and I was joking around with his parents and photographing him. And then going back at night and setting up and doing a 30-second exposure with that same 16 millimeter fisheye lens. And I'm actually, I'm in between two of these, right on the edge of this line set up on the wet cement, and then waiting for a car to come each way. I have so many shots where there's, suddenly the car stopped looking for a parking spot. So, it wound up being this 15-minute exercise waiting for the cars to come each way and time it. It's just fun stuff. You can start creatively working with motion flowing through your scene. There's a real move right now. I see a lot of people slapping 10 stops in neutral density on and shooting waterfalls at 6 to 30 seconds. And it's an interesting look. To me, I really like waterfalls at about a half a second, usually, and water moving through rivers and tidal action somewhere around a half a second, a quarter second to a second. Half a second is kind of what I start with. Is just, I love to see the underlying motion, to feel that kind of texture of the water, but have it smooth at the same time. So I wind up, most of my tidal and waterfall images, I find that half a second is just more interesting to me. You might be able to use a polarizer on an overcast day to get that half a second. Here's a magnificent waterfall in Patagonia. Panther Creek Falls. If you look up here at exposure data, you keep seeing half a second is something that's my initial take on waterfalls. But then, like any photographic rule, it's really made to be broken. And, here's one where, I'm shooting at 200th of a second because Rick and I were scouting for a Yellowstone Teton Moab workshop series that we're going to do this fall, coming up in October. We're going to be launching that pretty soon. But this is up at the Tower Falls, and shooting this at a half a second, it didn't look right. It was jumbled. It lost the power, So I just backed off and shot it at 200th of a second. I'm like, that's the power of that waterfall. Sometimes a scene calls for longer or shorter. Here's Punch Bowl Falls, which is kind of at the epicenter of the Eagle Creek fire a few years ago in our Columbia River Gorge. And the way the water was flowing just didn't look very good at a half a second. I reviewed it in the viewfinder and just decided to go long, put some neutral density on, went 25 seconds. And here's another one where the wave action in the South Cliffs of San Diego, just the wave action was messy every time I tried to photograph it until I slowed it down more than a half a second. I just liked it at 2.5, turning into mist. Here's a river where I somehow the shape of the rocks, that plastic kind of long exposure flow, looks surreal to me. I took this at a half a second and I like it, but I really like the longer one. You have to kind of explore and play with your scene and try different shutter speeds and really review your images on the back of your camera or in your viewfinder with mirrorless and see what you like best. But again, I come back to half a second. This is from our panorama project. When we do these projects like the long exposure project, Rick and I participate as well. And this was another view of Panther Creek Falls, a little tougher to get to view of it. And this is a big panorama, like 2 rows shot at a half a second. And one thing you have to think about when you're doing long exposure in a scene as complex as this is, what is going on with the wind? Is the wind blowing leaves? And so, I went to this specifically on a day that wasn't so windy, kind of in between storms, and was able to kind of time my shots on an overcast day where the light wasn't changing in between little gusts that were puffing through, and got a pretty nice sharp scene of this. But if I was shooting it in a single frame and the wind was blowing a little bit, I might shoot it at a half a second for the waterfall, and then keep the exposure consistent, but shoot it fast enough to freeze that motion in the foliage, and then go in and blend the two, just paint the blurred waterfall motion and water motion in over the one with the sharp vegetation. This is an example where I did that. This is a 3-second exposure on the southern coast of the Olympic National Park. And there were these cormorants, and I fired so many frames of this at 3 seconds, and I was waiting for the birds to hold still, and always one of them was moving. And I was locked down for long exposure on the tripod. So all I had to do was find a frame where this bird was still, a frame where that bird was still, and a frame where that bird was still, and blend them so that I had a still bird in each position. There wasn't a single frame where all of them were still. Here's an example. You have to think about the motion. It's all about the motion. It's all about that shutter speed with long exposure. Here's Stromboli on the trip in 2015. Actually, Rick was along on this trip to the Greek part of it. It was for a friend of ours' wedding, and then Stacy and I traveled down through southern Italy and into France, or up, I should say. And this is Stromboli, just off of Sicily. It's a volcano that erupts really frequently. It's like every 5 to 10 minutes it erupts a little bit. Last year it actually erupted in a big way that evacuated the island and killed some people. So I'm glad that didn't happen while we were there. But you hike up at Blue Hour, and you actually are looking down on the Mediterranean Sea. You've got dinner cruises down here on boats. And I cased it for a while, watched it erupting, and I realized each eruption is lasting about 10 to 15 seconds. And so I set my shutter speed at 13 seconds and just started experimenting with, what's the right exposure for that Blue Hour, kind of a little bit underexposed, where I don't overexpose the eruption. And it doesn't happen like this where it's all happening at once. It's, it's like a Roman candle fizzling along for a while until it stops. And so I wanted to capture all of that in one frame. So this is 13 seconds of it doing that. You just got to kind of work. It's a fireworks or fire like this. You have to sort of, figure out how much of it do you want to capture, how much of the time of it doing that motion do you want to capture, and then backwards work with your ISO and your aperture to make sure that you've got the right exposure for that, maybe a little neutral density. Here's an example. I tend to like fireworks at 2 to 3 seconds, 1.5 to 3 seconds. This is Bastille Day, once the fireworks started going off that year, same trip. And then later in the night, as it got really smoky, a 3-second exposure with, only the light of the fireworks silhouetting the Eiffel Tower through the smoke. You can just get creative with these long exposures. If you took a fast exposure of these fireworks, you wouldn't get the whole bursts. You wouldn't get these flowers the way that they're blooming. And any of these long exposures, you're going to take a lot of frames and be kind of ranging in on the look that you want as you're working. Here's I don't know why. Oh, there it is. Here's a whole crew of us. DC and Jason were there on a beautiful night up at Delicate Arts shooting the Milky Way. And, I think this one's just reminding me that camera support is so critical if you're doing long exposures. You've got to be locked down, rock solid. I think that's the foundational piece, knowing what camera settings to use. Filtration's important, but that tripod and head are just critical. If you don't have a rock solid tripod and head, you're not going to get a good long exposure. This is my favorite long exposure of 2020. We went down and visited Charlie, where he lives on the southern Oregon coast. We're kind of cooking up a workshop for late summer this year down in this region. And we went down there. I drove down specifically on a night where we could go for this shot with the Milky Way, and did a little light painting and used a star tracker to actually do 100-second exposure at 1.8 with my 20 millimeter while it's rotating with the Milky Way to get a nice sharp Milky Way, and then blended it in to a foreground exposure that was captured without the camera moving. So just fun stuff. There's so much to work with long exposure. I think it just opens up your possibility of creating better quality, more enlargeable, better printable images working in low light situations with lower ISO, or get really creative with things that move. And the more you do it, the more you start seeing things. I wonder what that would look like if I slowed time down. You know, lets us play with time moving through our image. So with that, should we, anybody else have any comments in our crew here? David or Rick or Darren or Woody? Should we open it up to some questions?
Well, I think so. Some a little bit more specifics might help. When you're thinking long exposure, first of all, it seems as though long exposure to you is half a second to however long. Is that?
No, I think what I'm saying with long exposure is it's a situation, you know, there's sports and action kinds of things where you're hand holding and tracking and trying to blur motion. And that isn't really what long exposure is. For me, long exposure is where you're locked down, rock solid, and you're letting time move through your frame, you know, either for the purpose of having an exposure that's got more quality to it with, you know, a narrower aperture and or a lower ISO, or you're trying to specifically let time pass through in a creative way. But it's the kind of, we're talking about stuff where you need to get locked down, rock solid, get your shutter to release without touching, you know, without inducing camera shake while you're doing it. Think about whether you're employing long exposure noise reduction or not, vibration, all those settings that you want to make sure.
All right, so let's back up then just a little bit. So we'll take the tripod lockdown as the given starting place for long exposure. So, and you want to have some sort of mechanism for being able to set to press the shutter without having to actually touch the camera. So an intervalometer or something else.
I mean, back in the days of film, it was as simple as a little cable that reached out and pushed the shutter button when you squeezed it, you know, and I used that kind of release for DSLR with a 10-pin connector for years and years. You know, these days you can get a little Bluetooth piece. I've got one right here inside my L bracket and fire it with your phone, you know, that's there all the time. There's all kinds of options for that, but you're gonna want a way to fire your camera without inducing shake. You know, a lot of cameras have an exposure delay mode where you can go into the settings and say, I want you to wait 2 seconds after I push the button and then capture the image. On a DSLR, it'll lift the mirror, wait 2 seconds, open and close the shutter and drop the mirror again.
So let's talk about neutral density filters and how you use them and why you use them. And, you know, there's neutral density filters of all different stops and types and everything else like that. That's not what this is about, but how do you think about using neutral density in the context of long exposure?
So neutral density is going to be a thing that's more employed in the second type of long exposures that we're talking about, the creative long exposure. You know, when you're photographing the landscape and you're just trying to get a higher quality image and sharp front to back, your enemy can be low light because you need to turn up the ISO and you need to, you know, maybe narrow your aperture to get the foreground to background and focus, and that makes you, you know, turn up your ISO more if you're not rock solid and stable and doing a long exposure. So you wind up using long exposures in low lit landscapes, post sunset, blue hour, Milky Way, just to get the highest possible quality image. When it comes to creative imaging, maybe you're out in broad daylight and you want to blur that waterfall, your correct exposure, you know, at your base ISO and your narrowest aperture might be something like a 30th of a second if you're in broad daylight at a waterfall, and you need to, you know, put something in front of that lens in order to reduce the intensity of light coming through it to the sensor. So that's what neutral density is all about. And so you putting a perfectly neutral pair of dark glasses in front of your lens, and you don't want to skimp on the quality of those filters, because if you buy cheap neutral density filters, they can induce color casts, weird sort of color effects that are tough to fix. There can even be sort of patterns that come out of them. I'm not a giant fan of most variable neutral density filters. Actually, I've never used a variable neutral density filter that I liked, including one that was like $800 designed for broadcast journalism. they're okay from maybe 2 to 4 or 6 stops, but then they start to break down. I tend to like to buy a good, solid neutral density filter and I carry a 4-stop, a 6-stop, and a 10-stop. And I use a polarizer if I need just a little bit. So neutral density is a way to slow down your exposure beyond what you can do in natural light. And the other great thing about neutral density is, if you're in a situation where everything you want to photograph is out at infinity, and you don't need something sharp up in the foreground, well, you can set your lens to its best possible aperture, get everything out there focused, and then use neutral density to get the shutter speed that you want at your base ISO. So it starts to be something, the more you do it, the more you sort of intuitively reach for the correct neutral density filter. There was a workshop that David Archer and I were on in Cannon Beach, North Oregon coast one year. And there's someone who will totally remain nameless, a really fun workshop participant who was out there with a travel tripod, not usually my favorite tripod. And he was shooting, and he had this, I went to look at what was going on his camera, and it was just, it was kind of like a high key scene of Haystack Rock. It was just a little bit of rock and everything else pure white. And I said, "Oh, what are you doing there?" And his response was, "Well, I'm doing a long exposure." And I said, "Huh, do you have any neutral density?" And he said, "No." And I got an adapter out, and I just kind of looked at it, and I just guessed, and I put a 6-stop neutral density filter in front of his camera, and he tripped the thing again, and it just was luck. It was, there's a little bit of having done it a lot, but kind of pure luck. It was perfect exposure. And his response was, "That's amazing." This is like, it's just so much fun. Suddenly you have the ability, the waves are all blurred. There's mist around the rocks. Everything was a perfect exposure. The sky looked normal. So neutral density can just be really fun. And there's a bunch of ways that neutral density can come. You can get a round filter like these Hoya Solus filters that I use all the time. I have this little magnetic filter holder on here, Manfrotto zoom system, so that if I instead of the threads on there, it's just a little magnetic thing that threads over that. And then I put a lens adapter on the end of my lens and just whoop. I don't buy a set of filters for every sized lens that I have. I buy them at the biggest size lens I'm ever likely to have. And then I adapt them from the smaller lenses out. You can get these little, there are little rings, the step-up rings. Right now I'm putting an 82 millimeter filter on a 67 millimeter lens by just putting a step-up ring from 67 to 82 and then that magnetic holder.
The step-up rings are great, and you can buy a set of them that will cover an enormous range of lens openings for like $25-$30. I mean, I've got 2 sets of them that go pretty much from 28 all the way up to 82.
I would recommend, knowing what lenses you tend to carry in the field, getting ones that go directly from the lens to the size filter that you have, though. Don't use a pyramid of them stretching out, one to another, to another, to another, because you get more chance of vignetting, of getting that filter out into the frame so that you lose the corners of your image. I have a set of, everything I do is 82, except for this new crazy 14 to 24 Nikon lens that has this funky hood that goes on and puts it into a 112 millimeter filter. And so I've been testing some 112 millimeter filters, but that's a bit specialty. Most people, unless you have that lens, you don't need that. 82 tends to work for just about everything. I've been testing a bunch of filters. I've been a Hoya ambassador for a long time. I was skeptical early on about UV filters and sky filters in front of your lens because of image degradation. And Hoya kind of hit me up to test some of their new filters they were coming out with when they launched the HD3 filters. And I took them on that trip to Europe that I was showing you photos from and really tested the heck out of them, shooting with and without them and into the sun. And I was pretty blown away. And over the years, I've become a big fan of having them. And if you get to that magnificent landscape seeing you can screw them off and have a perfectly clean lens underneath. It's like lens cap number 2, just to keep a perfect clean piece of glass underneath. But I also tested their Solus infrared neutral density filters, and I've been using those for years, and I love them. They're wonderful perfectly neutral, really high quality filters. But I've also been testing some stuff from Case that's really good. Nisi's making really good filters. I know Breakthrough makes really good filters. I haven't tested them extensively, but I've used them a little bit. The square filters can be cool too. I just got Case sent me this thing where it's this really thin bunch of optical glass, really strong neutral density filters. And it comes with this holder that's really thin and lightweight. And there's magnetic polarizer that drops in if you want. And you can just drop this magnetic polarizer in, and there's a little dial on the side that spins it. And then you can, if you want to polarize your scene creatively, like you're in a wet woods, for example, and you want to green up that wet vegetation by cutting through the reflectivity on the leaves, you can put neutral density in front of it to slow your waterfall down and still spin your polarizer back behind it just by turning that little dial. There's some cool, innovative stuff coming out. I feel like Rick and I were talking the other day, Rick, and you said it's like a renaissance in photographic optics right now. Yeah. Every camera company is coming out with better lenses than we've ever had before. And I think that's happening in the filter industry too.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I can't overemphasize enough as someone who's bought 2 sets of variable ND filters, they're not worth the money you pay for them. They really are not.
I just got hit up by Haida to test their latest magnetic variable neutral density filter, and I haven't responded yet, but my response is going to be something like, I'm happy to test it, and if I hate it, I'll send you notes about why, or I'll tell you why I don't like it. I'm not going to review it and tell people to buy it if it doesn't. But with the caveat that I've never liked a variable neutral density filter. If you think you can impress me, send it to me, and I'll test it out and tell you what I think. But as I said, I've tested a lot of them, and I've spent in the earlier days, I spent a lot of money on them and felt really shortchanged.
Well, and I think that was the case. That's what we were talking, as you said, about sort of a renaissance right now. 10 years ago, there were only a couple of companies that were making high quality neutral density filters that had no color cast, that were perfectly created. I mean, Lee was one of the first that really did it. But if you wanted to buy into the Lee system, you were spending a lot of money, and you're still going to spend money on really good neutral density filters, especially if you have, a 4 and a 6 and a 10 stop. But there's so many companies out there that are making really great neutral density and other filters that it's kind of hard to go wrong as long as you're paying attention to the reviews of them, so.
Oh, I agree, and I think that from my testing right now, I can say that Hoya makes top-notch glass. Nisi seems to make really good filters too. Case is making great stuff that's innovative and a little bit cheaper, and I'm finding it extremely neutral. It's really good quality stuff. I'm having fun kind of playing around with that. And then Breakthrough is also making really good filters too. None of them are cheap though, but they're all trustworthy.
I mean, Elizabeth says that she uses Format High Tech, and she thinks they're great.
They have a bit of a color cast in my testing of those, but so do the Lees. I mean, they're just that's I prefer the glass filters, and Lee is glass, but it just has a bit of a blue cast. Lee is really correctable. It just throws it just a little bit blue.
Yeah. Carl asks, is a 15 stop neutral density filter worth having?
For eclipses, I have a 16 stop that I used in the Eclipse. I mean, if it's a good quality, I have a Hoya Pro ND 16 stop filter that's very neutral, but it's absolutely impossible to focus through, or the camera has a hard time metering through something like that. So it's a bit of trial and error, making sure you have your exposure right. It's amazing. It used to be, I had this whole methodology for how to calculate your exposure with a 10 stop neutral density filter, but all the latest cameras I've used get really close with their meter shooting through 10 stops in neutral density. And it's kind of blown my mind. The Nikon Z cameras that I'm using will do low light autofocus right through the neutral density filter at 10 stops if you open the lens up. I haven't tried it with lenses that don't open up to, you know, f4 or less, but it's pretty amazing what these modern cameras are capable of looking through. I still would recommend that you set up, get your composition, get your focus all dialed in, figure out what aperture you want to make sure that you have everything that you want in focus in the scene. Then put the neutral density filter on and figure out, you know, how much neutral density you need to keep as close to base ISO as you can with that.
That's one of the reasons these magnetic filter holders are so good.
Yeah, and the square is handy too. I mean, it's not hard to pull those up and down.
And what about stacking? And I mean, would you stack the Hoya 10 and the 6 if you needed 16 stops? And you wouldn't.
No. There's occasions to stack a circular polarizer in with an ND filter if you want the polarizing effect. If you want to look through the water to the bottom of the lake, or if you want to enhance the reflection of the mountain on the lake and not see the bottom, or if you want to cut that reflectivity and that wet green foliage in the forest as you blur the waterfall and really green the scene up. Or if you want to cut the reflectivity of the house windows and the real estate photography that you're doing and yet blur their fountain moving through the front yard. There's reasons to use a neutral density filter in conjunction with a polarizer if you need to slow the scene down more than the polarizer is going to do for you. The polarizer gives you about a stop to 2 stops of slower shutter speed. It is darker, but you know, there are times to do that. That's why I think that this case system's so neat, in that you can spin it. You can successfully stack neutral density, and really good neutral density shouldn't have a big problem with that. However, you're introducing more chance of reducing the optical quality of your image. I would much rather put one piece of glass in front of my great lens than multiple.
Let's see some other questions here. So Elizabeth asks, my intention is to reduce noise as much as possible with long exposures. So is it preferable to use a wider aperture and shorter exposure, 3 to 4 seconds, as opposed to 20 to 30 seconds, or a smaller aperture and longer exposure?
It totally, you know, this is what we talk about a lot. Knowing your gear. It really depends on your lens. How good is your lens stopped way down? You know, is your lens a lot better in the f8 range? Some lenses, like this new 14 to 24, a lot of the new Nikon Z glass that I'm using is at its absolute optimum sharpness, edge to edge, at around f3.5, f5.6. So, you know, you're actually starting to introduce diffraction by the time you get to f10, and you start losing image quality, a little bit of sharpness, the more you stop that lens down. So, you know, if you have a scene where you're not worried about keeping your foreground and your background all in focus at the same time, you're better off shooting at a wider aperture with more neutral density. If you're trying to blur a scene, it just completely depends. I think that you're generally pretty safe shooting between about f5.6 and f11 from an image quality standpoint. I think the engineers tend to build lenses to perform really well in there. Some lenses kind of start to deteriorate between f11 and you know, their maximum f-stop, say f22, but when they hit that maximum, suddenly they get better again. You know, it's something that you have to just play around with your lens and see how it performs, or read reviews of your lens. There's always reviews out there of every lens out there.
Well, and some of it really is going out there and experimenting and practicing, you know, find some that might not be the most optimal setting for your stuff, but play around with those types of things just to sort of see what works and what doesn't work and what's acceptable to you in terms of noise.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Yeah. I think that the one thing that's been really fun, that software that David Archer turned me on to, Focal software by Rycan, you can, you know, depending on your camera brand, you can plug that camera into your computer, fire up Focal, point it at a target. It'll tell you how far away to set it from the target. You can print your own target from their software. And then it'll take a whole series of images at every aperture and analyze what's the sharpest from that lens. It's kind of a neat aperture sharpness test. I've been doing that a lot with my lenses and finding surprising results. It's interesting.
And those are when you calibrate a lens like that, is it remembered in the software? I mean, in the camera, or?
Well, okay, that's different. There's autofocus calibration that Rican does, that Focal software does, and yes, basically it walks you through. With Canon, I think it completely takes control of the camera and does the autofocus calibration for you. With Nikon, it walks you through the steps. It has you set it to +20 to -20 to +10 to -10. And it says set it to +3 and you're done. And what happens with the focus calibration in camera is it knows the serial number of that lens electronically when it's put on. So the minute it recognizes that lens, it sets it to +3. So, the Rican walks you through getting the right setting. It'll do all the shooting. All you have to do, all it does is tell you to change the setting in the menus of the camera for different autofocus calibration settings, and walks you through. But there's also this one where you just plug it in, point it at the target, and tell it you want to run a sharpness analysis if you have the Rican Focal Pro, and it'll shoot that target at every aperture, run it through, analyze the sharpness of the target, and then tell you which apertures of your lens are sharp and where it falls off and where you start worrying about diffraction. It's pretty neat. Gives you a graph.
You've done an ATS on that one?
Yep.
Okay.
I have links to Focal. It's at B&H in my ATS links page too.
Okay. Long exposure noise reduction. I had a couple of questions just sort of about using that. Why would you use it? Other instances where you wouldn't use it, that type of thing.
My opinion, so long exposure noise reduction doubles your exposure time. It's great. What it does is, sensors are going to behave a little bit differently in different environmental situations. Maybe it's a humid environment, maybe it's cold out, warm out. It totally affects how the sensor is going to behave with a really long exposure. And what winds up happening is sometimes pixels fizzle out, or you get a blue pixel or a red pixel or a white pixel. I think we've all done star photography and come back and been like, why is there a red pixel in the middle of the rock? And what long exposure noise reduction does is it shoots your image as you want to the sensor. Then it leaves the shutter closed and takes a dark frame exactly the same amount of time, then analyzes those two and sees, well, where is the sensor having problems, and repairs it in the file. So you get a cleaner image with less work to do in post-production. If you have time to do long exposure noise reduction, it's a good thing. There are situations, that you're just trying to get, 2-minute exposures out of the Milky Way. Things are changing fast. You don't want to double the amount of time it's taking you to capture each frame. And I would argue you can turn it off while you're honing in and figuring out your scene to just speed that up, because a lot of times you take, a 90-second exposure, look at, oh, it's too dark. Oh, the composition's not right, because you're working in pitch blackness, if you're doing something really dark, late blue hour or with stars. And so turning that off can really speed up your process of getting it right. And then if you can remember to turn it back on before you want to make your final image. Now, obviously, if you're doing time lapse or you want to capture star trails in a whole series of long exposure images to weave together, you're not going to be able to use it. There's situations where you're just either limited by battery power, time, or the creative purpose that you have. But I think in general, it's a good idea to use.
Okay. Jason asked about handling, we talked a little bit about it, but, wind and foliage and, things that move in long exposure shots. Mm-hmm. He says, I've experimented with shooting short exposures in the scene, blending the image, masking out the blurred foliage with the crisp leaves and grass from a shorter exposure, but wondered if that's the best way to do it.
I guess it depends on the scene and the image, but I think in general, you're probably going to have an easier time thinking about that in reverse. You shoot a fast frame to freeze the motion of the foliage, watch where your exposure meter is, and then use neutral density or just exposure to slow it down, but keep that balance in the same spot. If you were a third of a stop over on the meter or half a stop under or whatever, you liked for a look, you're in manual mode. Get that slow exposure dialed in exactly the same, and then just paint what you wanted blurred in on the scene that was sharp and crisp everywhere else. Because I think it's going to be harder to blend sharp foliage in with foliage that, you know, between two images than it is to just blend the water flowing through the scene or the clouds flowing through the scene or the traffic on the road.
Sometimes you want that ghosted image, though. I've got a bunch of shots that I've taken on the Oregon coast, you know, long exposure shots where I've got people that are just sort of like these wisps that are just sort of moving through the scene.
I love that.
You know, it all depends on what type of effect you're looking for.
Right. Well, and I think Jason's more talking about using long exposure to get that really sharp, crisp, still life landscape image. And you know, again, you can get creative. I've seen, you know, those lavender fields in France that are so popular. One of my favorite shots I've seen of that was a really long exposure in the wind where it's just all blurred and it has this Monet-like impressionist feel to it. And I was like, well, that's a different photo of that scene I've seen a million times. It's cool.
Yep. What about color and long exposure? You know, do you run into, I know that when I've shot a lot of night scenes, long exposure, like cityscapes and things like that, I have a harder time with color correction than I do with a shorter exposure. You notice anything?
And you're not talking about a neutral density effect. You're talking about just being out there.
No.
Oh, you know, I think that as you start to get into, especially with cityscapes, there are so many different colors of light in the city. Yeah. Some are warm, some are fluorescent green, some are, you know, bluish from LED, that you just have to kind of creatively pick. It's nice if you have a gray building or a gray bit of concrete that you know is supposed to be neutral that you can click on. But, you know, I think in general, I like a tungsten-y kind of warm night cityscape, you know, so I'll sort of start with that and then tweak it to taste. But yeah, I mean, in the landscape, it's easier. It feels like to me, but
you run into color issues with neutral density filters. I mean, aside from something have a cast.
Yeah, not really good ones. There is the ability, especially with these backlit Sony sensors that are so sensitive, you can start picking up infrared light and you get this weird kind of red pattern noise that neither color noise reduction nor luminance noise reduction really addresses. It's actually infrared channel kind of being captured by the sensor. And that's where these Hoya Solus infrared neutral density filters and the Nisi infrared neutral density filters really come into their own. And I know I think Lee's new best line is supposed to be very color neutral and has infrared in it as well, if I remember right, if what I've read's right. But I think it's something that's needing to be addressed because our sensors are getting so good. And when you're doing really long exposures, it starts to bleed through. A couple of questions that sort of just about body stabilization, or, you know, when you're taking long exposures, you know, should you have, you know, vibration reduction or whatever turned off? This was the thing that was so much more important a few years back. It's still really important if you're using cameras from a few years back. I think the early generations of image stabilization, vibration reduction, whatever your company called it, tended to overcompensate if the camera was still. You know, they're looking for motion and the motors and the hum of the motors inside, and it's straining to kind of try to gyro balance your own motion handheld would actually induce shake on the tripod. So it was always, you know, you get on the tripod, you turn off vibration reduction. These days, I still think it's a good idea. It's in general a good practice. If you're going out to shoot stars or long exposure, it's not a bad idea to turn off the in-body image stabilization and vibration reduction on your lens. I think that it's far less important because the systems have gotten so much more nuanced. They recognize when they're still and just shut down. You know, it's something that I will admit I generally forget, and with my equipment, it doesn't make any difference. But I think that as a general practice, it's a good idea to remember to turn it off. That should be your default. Should be turn it off when you're doing long exposure.
Do you have any advice or special tips when trying to do a long exposure at the ocean with respect to things like wave action, especially if you're doing a pano or something?
Yeah. Well, you know, with wave action, I think you have a choice. I like that quarter to a second shutter length. That's the same as I like for waterfalls. I like to be able to see the structure in the waves. You can feel the motion of them rolling through the scene. You're blurring things some, but you still feel that undulation of the sea coming at you. Or I like it really long. I think that if you get in between, it starts to just look a little messy. It's just it's more distracting. I think that if you go with the 30-second or beyond, you start just having a mist boiling around the rocks from the surf. With panoramas, it's a little more complicated because if you're capturing sharp images of waves rolling through, you need to time it so that they're in close to the same place, so the blending software can match them up. With long exposure, that's less of a concern. It's more about a creative decision based on how you want to render the scene. And I would just suggest people, shoot it at half a second and then shoot it really long and see which one you like better in post. And as you start to do that more and more, you'll start to adjust a little bit.
Can you do HDR and long exposure together? Would you try that?
Sure. Yeah, you can do that. It's when I do HDR with a modern camera, I just set up bracketing. And I like to have the first shot on the meter. And then usually my bracketing these days, the sensors are so good. There's so much dynamic range, at least with what I'm working with. One on the meter, 1 3 stops underexposed, and I have everything I need. It's really rare I need anything more than that. So,
yeah, and pretty much all modern cameras have a bracketing mode.
Yeah, you can also do it manually in manual mode. You can just watch your meter, shoot it on the meter, and roll it back to 3 stops underexposed, and shoot it again.
Yeah.
Now, the only problem with that is that you're gonna want to. Well, that's one thing where on one's HDR blending is nice because you can choose which is your base image for ghosting, and that way you can say, I want the clouds blurred this much, not that much. You know what I mean? It's a little bit automated. Most of the others out there, where picking the one that's the one you want for base image for ghosting is nice, because then you get the motion that you wanted in the scene and yet all the dynamic range of both shots. There's a little less control in Lightroom.
Yeah. Okay, I'm looking through sort of the last of the questions. Most of the questions I think you've kind of touched upon.
There was one question about whether I use Lightroom or whether I use ON1, and the real answer to that is both.
I'm talking the long exposure questions.
Long exposure. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we've kind of touched on everything. I kind of feel like you did.
I'll give a little quick disclaimer too, that this project and the long exposure course that I put together, I touch on doing star photography and I talk about it a bit, but I want to do a specific course and project as we come into the early part of the Northern Hemisphere's Milky Way season this year that's really focused on shooting stars in the Milky Way. So this is more of sort of, I would call that long exposure part 2, where you get into the nuts and bolts of star trackers and star stacking and the 500 rule versus the MPF rule and all that. That's a whole kind of complicated topic of its own. This is just kind of base long exposure. And since a lot of us are sort of holed up, quarantined still, it's nice because there's always things that are moving around your house, and most of us are in winter time. And so, the Milky Way is not so available to us without traveling for it. So.
Okay.
Oh, I did want to quickly, for those, well, Woody, you're sending a link to the projects page, right, Woody?
Yeah, it was posted.
Okay. So, I mean, if you go to my website and you go into training, into projects, you just have to choose that you're interested in long exposure, put your email and hit send, and we'll make sure you guys have early advance notice before we send it out to the entire list.
Well, I think we're just about at time. Woody, you have anything else to close here?
Nope. We'll probably do another office hours in a couple of weeks. Honestly, we haven't talked about the topic yet, so we'll get that worked out here in the next few days and posted. So,
well,
we didn't talk to Woody about it. Rick and I were talking about it yesterday. we left you hanging in the dark there, man. something that neither of us do a whole lot of, but that would be fun is let's talk about macro photography.
Yeah. Oh, Woody just went dark.
Woody went dark.
Like these guys, the talent, they go crazy. They go off on their own.
I just learned there was wine scent. Nobody tells me anything.
Well, we had so much fun with Gary and the project, and he was to send Rick and I a
See
thank
that?
you.
You see
Yeah,
that?
good buddy.
You are my good buddy. You are my
Yes.
good buddy.
Okay.
We've been talking over Christmas, man.
No,
right.
I just want to say thanks, everyone. And at any time, if you drop your email into any part of Hudson's site, you'll get emails based on, these office hours and projects and upcoming workshops and everything. So just be in touch and let us know you're interested, and we'll make sure to get everyone information.
Oh, one last thing. I mentioned I would address some of the technical questions that came in via email. And I will, but if I miss you somehow and you have a glaring, always send me an email. It may take me a couple days when I'm super busy and the kids are going crazy and we don't, they're not in daycare, but I will get to it. So.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Right. Have a great couple weeks.
Thanks so much to David and Darren and Woody and Rick too, and everybody else. I appreciate it. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.